People love to romanticize billion-dollar exits as if they were the grand finales of some perfectly scripted entrepreneurial saga. Fireworks, champagne, headlines, and smiling founders ringing bells on Wall Street. But anyone who has walked even a single mile inside the shoes of a real founder knows the truth. Billion-dollar exits are not celebrations. They are detonations. They are the violent collision of years of ambition, fear, sacrifice, betrayal, reinvention, and luck. So much damn luck, compressed into a moment the world mistakes for victory. I learned this truth not from books or documentaries, but from living through the chaos surrounding some of the most iconic acquisitions and IPOs of my generation. I watched friends become legends overnight, and others lose everything right when it looked like they'd finally won. Because the story of billion-dollar exits isn't about money, it's about the cost. And the cost is always higher than anyone imagines. My first real exposure to this world came years ago, when a founder I admired, someone I'd watched scrape together his startup from nothing but caffeine and desperation, called me at midnight. He had just received an acquisition offer for $900 million. You'd think he'd be ecstatic. He wasn't. He was terrified. "If I take it, I betray the mission," he said. "If I don't, I might lose everything." That's the part outsiders don't see. Billion-dollar decisions often feel like choosing between two tragedies. For weeks, he wrestled with the offer. His board pushed him to accept. His early team begged him to consider what cashing out would mean for their families. His users accused him of selling out. His investors threatened consequences if he declined. In the end, he said yes, not out of excitement, but out of exhaustion. And the day the news broke, the world celebrated while he sat alone in a hotel room, staring at his reflection and whispering, "Why doesn't this feel like winning?" That was the night I understood that exits don't define founders, they expose them. But there were other stories where the exit wasn't fear, but fire. One of the most iconic IPOs I ever witnessed belonged to a founder who had been written off so many times that dead company walking became an inside joke. He had mortgaged his house twice. Investors ghosted him. Competitors mocked him publicly. Employees left in waves. And yet, somehow, he kept going, building, iterating, begging the universe for one more inch of survival. When his company finally reached the scale needed for an IPO, the bankers didn't believe the numbers. They made him redo audits, reviews, projections. They poked and prodded like surgeons trying to prove the patient was faking his pulse. And on the morning of the IPO, as he stood on the balcony overlooking the trading floor, tears streamed down his face. Not tears of joy, but tears of relief. Relief that the years of humiliation had meant something. Relief that he could finally look at his children and feel like he hadn't failed them. Relief that the world had stopped seeing him as a delusional dreamer. When the opening bell rang, the company soared past $1 billion valuation within minutes. Cameras flashed, reporters praised him, strangers treated him like a genius. But he whispered to me afterward, "Nobody will ever understand how close I came to quitting. Not even I understand how I survived. Billion-dollar exits aren't luck. They are endurance. They are the reward for surviving long enough for the world to finally agree you were right. But the truth is, for every founder who makes it to that moment, dozens fall just short." I once knew a team that turned down a $600 million acquisition because they believed they could push to $1 billion. They were convinced the next product update would unlock exponential growth. They said no. 6 months later, a competitor launched something frighteningly similar. Users flocked away, revenue plummeted, and the acquisition offer evaporated. Within a year, they shut down. I attended their final all-hands meeting. The room felt like a funeral. They weren't mourning the company, they were mourning what could have been. That day, I learned that the line between visionary and cautionary tale is thinner than anyone likes to admit. But there is one story, the one I lived personally, that taught me more about exits than all the others combined. Our company had been approached by a global tech giant, one of those names that makes your heart pound when it appears in your inbox. They wanted to acquire us. Their offer wasn't just life-changing, it was generational. The kind of deal that rewrites family histories. erases debts, and plants flags in places you once only fantasized about. But negotiations are never clean. They are battlefields disguised as conference rooms. Their lawyers dissected our company like a carcass. Their executives questioned our metrics, our roadmap, our stability. Their diligence team poked into every crack we had tried desperately to hide. And through it all, my team looked to me for calm. But inside, I was unraveling. Because while they were evaluating our numbers, I was evaluating myself. Was I ready to let go of something I had bled to build? Was I ready for my identity to be swallowed whole by a corporation? Was I ready to admit that someone else could take my creation further than I could? There is a moment in every acquisition journey when money collides with ego, and you must decide which part of you wins. One night, after 12 hours of negotiation that left my throat raw and my mind spinning, I sat alone in our dark office, staring at the offer document. I imagined what life would look like if I accepted. I imagined what life would look like if I refused. And the terrifying truth was that both futures felt like losses. Because billion-dollar exits don't just change your life, they erase the version of you that fought to get there. The final week before signing was torture. Investors called daily, pushing for a decision. Employees whispered anxiously in hallways, wondering what their future would look like. My family urged me to think about security. My co-founder argued that we had one more great chapter left in us if we just held on. And I felt like a man, standing between two cliffs, each step forward a kind of falling. But then something happened that shifted everything. A long-time user, someone who had built their livelihood using our product, sent me a message. They didn't know about the acquisition talks. They didn't know about the pressure, the sleepless nights, the fear. They simply wrote, "Your product changed my life. Don't ever stop building." That sentence hit me harder than any investor demand. Because billion-dollar exits aren't just financial decisions, they're moral ones. Who do you owe? Yourself? Your team? Your investors? Your users? The weight of that question nearly crushed me. But in that weight, I found clarity. I knew what I had to do. I walked into the negotiation room the next morning with a steadiness I hadn't felt in months. And I made the decision that would alter everything: our future, our trajectory, our legacy. The acquisition completed. Headlines erupted. My phone buzzed nonstop. People congratulated me as if I had won some grand prize. But the truth is, exits don't feel like victories. They feel like transformations. Something ends. Something begins. And in that strange liminal space, founders stand alone trying to understand who they are without the weight of the company they carried for years. Months after the deal closed, I visited our old office. The chairs, the whiteboards, the coffee mugs with fading logos, they were still there, but the energy was gone. It felt like walking through the skeleton of a life I no longer lived. And standing there, surrounded by ghosts of my former self, I finally understood why billion-dollar exits feel so heavy. They are not the end of a journey. They are the burial of one dream and the birth of another. And as I closed the office door behind me for the last time, I realized the next chapter of my life would depend entirely on whether I had the courage to take the first step toward becoming someone new, someone no longer defined by the sleepless years, the relentless grind, the bruised ego, the improbable victories, the impossible decisions that had shaped the founder I once was. That step felt heavier than the entire journey before it, because no one warns you about the identity crisis that follows a billion-dollar exit. People assume wealth fills the void. But money can't replace purpose. It can't quiet the habits of survival wired into your bones. It can't tell you who you are when the war you fought for years suddenly ends. In the months after the acquisition, I wandered mentally, emotionally, sometimes even physically through a kind of quiet wilderness. Everyone around me kept saying congratulations, as if the chapter had closed cleanly, neatly, triumphantly. But success doesn't close chapters. It exposes the cracks you never had time to look at. Suddenly, I had space, too much space. Silence where chaos used to live. Time where pressure used to sit on my chest like a weight. And in that silence, all the questions I had avoided for years rose to the surface like ghosts demanding attention. Who am I without the constant urgency? Who am I without a team looking to me for direction? Who am I without the mission that once kept me breathing through nights the rest of the world slept? These were not philosophical questions. They were identity wounds. Wounds that had been cauterized by adrenaline and reopened by stillness. And yet, as painful as that stillness was, it gave me something I hadn't felt in years: clarity. Because when the noise fades, the truth gets louder. And the truth was this: I didn't miss the stress. I didn't miss the chaos. I didn't even miss the title. What I missed was the building, the becoming, the raw, unrefined version of myself who dared to believe that something impossible could be made real. Billion-dollar exits don't kill the builder in you. They awaken him. But awakening is only the beginning. Rebirth hurts too. It took time, more time than I expected, for the fog to clear, for the guilt to soften, for the weight of the exit to loosen its grip on my chest. And during that time, I did what founders rarely allow themselves to do. I talked, honestly, vulnerably, with other founders who had crossed the same invisible bridge. One had sold his company for $2.1 billion and spent a year depressed afterward because he felt purposeless. Another had taken his company public and then spiraled when he realized that the applause fades faster than the identity crisis. A third told me he woke up the day after his acquisition and cried not from joy, but because he no longer knew what to do with his hands. Their stories didn't make me feel better, but they made me feel less alone. And that, strangely, was the first step of healing, realizing that exits don't break founders, they uncover them. Eventually, the fog began to lift. Slowly, quietly, like dawn creeping across the floorboards of a dark room, I began meeting new people, founders, at the beginning of their journeys, full of the naive courage I once had. I started advising them, not from a pedestal, but from the trenches of memory. And in their questions, their fears, their spark, I felt a pulse I thought I had lost. A pulse that reminded me that creation was still in my blood. One founder asked me, "Do you ever get over the exit?" I told him the truth. You don't get over it, you grow around it. And as I heard myself speak those words, something inside me clicked into place. The exit had not ended my journey. It had created room for a new one, a journey not driven by desperation, but by intention, not by survival, but by curiosity, not by proving myself, but by becoming myself. And for the first time since signing those documents, I felt something I hadn't felt in years: hunger. Not the frantic hunger of a man running from failure, but the steady, grounded hunger of someone ready to build again, not for validation, not for valuation, but for expression. With that realization came momentum. I began exploring ideas with the freedom I never had before, not constrained by runway, not pressured by investors breathing down my neck, not shaped by fear. The ideas were wild, raw, sometimes ridiculous, and that's how I knew I was alive again. Because innovation doesn't begin with certainty, it begins with permission. Permission to dream without constraints. Permission to fail without punishment. Permission to build without apology. And slowly, a new vision began to form. A vision that terrified me just enough to feel real. A vision that made my heartbeat quicken the way it used to in the early days. A vision that whispered, "You're not done." But this time, my approach was different. I wasn't chasing a billion-dollar exit. I didn't need to. I wasn't chasing survival. I had already survived. I wasn't chasing external validation. I had already learned the emptiness of it. This time, I was chasing alignment. Alignment with who I had become. Alignment with what I had learned. Alignment with the truth that you cannot measure the value of a founder by the size of his exit, but by the size of the life he builds afterward. That shift changed everything. I began assembling a small team, not the biggest talents, but the right ones. People who cared more about craft than clout. People who weren't afraid to question me. People who weren't dazzled by my exit because they were too busy trying to build something meaningful. Together, we explored technologies emerging at the edges of what the world believed was possible. We prototyped things that made no sense at first glance. We debated. We broke things. We rebuilt. And through it all, I felt something I had almost forgotten: joy. The joy of beginning again. The joy of creating without expectation. The joy of being a nobody in a room full of possibility. I realized then that billion-dollar exits don't define your legacy. What you build afterward does. Anybody can be lucky once, but to build again, to dare to love the climb after tasting the summit, that is the mark of a true founder. And as I look back on everything, the chaos, the pain, the triumph, the void, the rebirth, I understand now that exits are not endings. They are doorways. Some people walk through and stop. Others walk through and transform. And a rare few look at the horizon beyond that doorway and whisper, "One more time." If this story touched something in you, if it reminded you of a dream you abandoned, or a version of yourself you're ready to reclaim, tell me in the comments what part hit hardest. And if you want more raw, unfiltered founder stories like this, hit follow, because your next chapter might already be calling your name.